Okay. All right. This week's starting Shemos. Shemos, of course, talks of the situation that Klal Yisrael found itself in Mitzrayim, in Egypt, after the death of Yosef and his brothers. And the Torah tells us that Paro became Vayokam el Chadash al Mitzrayim, a new king, either a new king or a new reign of kings, took control of Egypt, and they felt threatened. Paro felt threatened by the Jewish people. And because of this, he devised a plan of enslaving them. And he was also felt threatened about the future generations of male children. According to the Medrash, he was told that the Redeemer of the Jewish people is going to be born. And he called the Miyaldos, the women that were involved in the giving of birth, that were helping in the giving of birth of the Jewish mothers. And he says that if a child is a male child, so you should kill it at birth. And if it's a female child, so then you can let it live. The Marsha, a very interesting Marsha, it's not pertinent to what we're discussing, but the Marsha says that at that point, Paro was not able to suggest to actually murder the Jewish children while they were alive. And because he says, Masa lehem simonim, he gave signs to them, whether the children would be male or female. So Paro, according to the Marsha, he was suggesting to the Miyaldos Ivrios that shortly before the birth of the children, they should do an abortion on the male Jewish children. Whatever the case, so the Torah tells us, "V'lo shamu al melech Mitzrayim," the Miyaldos Ivrios, they did not listen to the king of Egypt, and to the midwives, and because of this, he called them, and he said, why don't you fill what we say? So they said the Jewish women are very capable, and they give birth to they're able to give birth before we get there, and because of this, we're not in a position to harm the Jewish children. Of course, that was just an excuse. And the Medrash tells us, the Torah tells us, that when the midwives demonstrated their fear of God, so vayas lahem batim, which Rashi explains to mean, and that seems to be the explanation of the Medrash, or at least one of the Medrashim, that God rewarded the midwives, the Jewish midwives. And who were the Jewish midwives? So it was Yocheved, the mother of Moshe. It was Miriam, according to some Medrashim. According to other Medrashim, it was Elisheva, who was the wife of Aaron. But whatever it is, now some of the Mefarshim ask, how is it possible that there should be so few midwives for dealing with the Jewish births? Logic would dictate that there was sort of like a union of midwives, and they were the leaders of the Jewish midwives. But in any case, so vayas lahem batim, so Rashi doesn't take it literally, because the question is, what does it mean? Vayas lahem batim, God made for them houses. What does it mean, God made for them houses? So Rashi says, the Medrash says that vayas lahem batim, that the Medrash says that they made bate kahuna, bate levia, bate malchus. They had children who were the ancestors, or who became Kohanim, Leviim, and ultimately ancestors of Malchus, ancestors of the royal families of the Jewish people. And the question is, why is it? We have a general rule that HaKadosh Baruch Hu rewards and punishes midah keneged midah, in the manner of the deed, whether it was a good deed or a bad deed. God rewards and punishment. In other words, the purpose of reward and punishment was not just to pay back, but it was to teach. So from the nature of the reward, we can associate with the reward with the certain deeds that the Jewish people did. And in case of punishment, we could associate the punishment with the bad deeds that might have been committed by whoever. We see, in other words, let's say the Jewish people, the Egyptians, they drowned the Jewish children. So because of that, they were punished at Kriyas Yamsuf, that their soldiers, the remaining soldiers of Egypt, were drowned, in order to teach a lesson, not just to the Jewish people, but to the whole world, that the attitude of the Egyptians, the way they tortured and murdered the Jews, is not acceptable by heaven. So the question is, while certainly Yocheved and her daughter and daughter-in-law, whatever it might be, were deserving of a reward for the deeds that they did, what is the correlation between the reward of having Kahuna, Leviah, and Malchus, priest descendants who are priests? Priest is a bad word. Kohanim, Leviim, and Malchus, and royalty, leadership. And it's interesting that these three types of position are related to the concept of yichus, a pedigree. In other words, one can be a Kohen only if his father is a Kohen. One can be a Levi only if his father is a Levi. And even Malchus, you have to be from the family, from the Shevet Yehuda, and the preferred manner of Malchus. Not only it's the preferred manner, but unless there's a dispute, it's almost automatic that the son of the Melech, the son of the king, becomes his successor. Why is it that way? But I think it's very simple. There are positions that require skill. And skills are something that can be acquired later in life. we see the Torah, when it comes to counting the Jewish people. So when it comes to counting the other tribes, not Levi, so the Torah counts them from the age. The Torah counts them from the age of 20 years old. And why 20 years old? Because that's when they served in the army. Now, who served in the army? People that were soldiers. And to be a soldier requires skill. But the Torah didn't want that to be part of the personality of the Jew. We need an army. We need to defend ourselves. And sometimes, unfortunately, it's necessary to go to war. But that's not our goal in life. And that should not be our personality. But when it comes to the spiritual domain, that the spiritual domain has to become part and parcel of who the person is. So Shevet Levi, who had a spiritual task, was counted not just from the time they were not only from the time they entered the Beis Hamikdash to train in the service of God or to be in the service of God, but they were counted from the time they were 30 days old, because their training was not just to give them skills. Their training was to mold their personalities. And it's obvious. So when it comes to Kahuna, Leviah, Malchus, this requires not just skills that can be learned later. Being a soldier requires skills, but those are skills that can be learned later. But being a leader, being a Kohen, spiritual task, being a Levi, a spiritual task, and even Malchus, being a king, leadership, certainly would be better if it's done with training from the very birth, from the cradle. I was told that Rav Hutner said about my father, Zatzal. Rav Hutner knew my father from the time he was 12 years old. But he said about my father that my father had chibas Torah from the cradle. So because that was part of his personality. It wasn't just that he knew how to learn, that he was a great Talmid Chacham, that he was a Gaon. But Torah and him were one. Kihu chayechem. That was his whole life. So I think they saved the Jewish children, but in saving the Jewish children, they not only saved the Jewish children, and I'll go into explaining it more at length, they enabled the Jewish children from birth. And we see that it wasn't just a saving. They helped the Jewish children even after birth. And in a sense, they gave over the Masorah to the Jewish children from birth. Moshe Rabbeinu, Bas Paro gives him over to Yocheved. And that enabled Moshe Rabbeinu to have a spiritual upbringing, not just later when God appeared to him, but that enabled Moshe Rabbeinu to have a spiritual upbringing from the cradle onward. And so it was Midah Keneged Midah. It was similar to what they did. They saved the Jewish children, but they enabled the Jewish children from birth to be exposed to certain attitudes and to a certain environment. Now, the Rashbam says a different explanation. The Rashbam's explanation is, Vayas lehem batim, it doesn't mean that God made houses, but Paro made houses for them. Why? Because it was when he saw that the midwives feared God more than they feared his threats. So in a sense, he wanted to stop them from continuing to save the Jewish children. So he built special houses for them, almost like they were almost like imprisoned. Other Mefarshim say that it was that they lived within an area of people that were loyal to Paro, who made sure that the midwives did not have contact with pregnant Jewish ladies. Now, there are Rishonim that explain that the midwives were not Jews. In fact, there are Medrashim that say that the midwives were originally Egyptian women. And there are some that even suggest that these midwives underwent gerus, underwent conversion from being Egyptians to being Jews. And that's why it says, when they had fear of God. What do you mean when they had fear of God? But they say that it means when they underwent conversion. And some just say it was midwives, Egyptian women, who perhaps had a certain degree of morality in them. But the question is, how is it possible for these Egyptian women to defy the Melech Mitzrayim, whether they went through conversion or they didn't go through conversion? And it seems that they perhaps saved the Jewish children even before they went through conversion. So how is it possible in an Egyptian society, in a society that enslaved the Jewish people, that at that point looked down at the Jewish people, that they should do it? Now it's possible in Egypt. There were many different groups, and many different groups worship different of the Avodah Zarah. And there was a group in Egypt historically called the Hyksos. And there's reason to believe that the Hyksos were Egyptians who ruled over Egypt in the time that Yosef was the viceroy of Egypt. And it's possible to suggest, a new king arose over Egypt. That was when the Hyksos when the Hyksos Hyksos were expelled from positions of authority. Many, of course, were killed out. Many had to leave Egypt. But there might have been a group that, in a sense, appreciated what Yosef did for Egypt, what Yosef did for them. Perhaps some of the Erev Rav, who all of a sudden left Egypt together with the Jewish people. Of course, they caused a lot of harm later on. But why did they identify with the Jewish people? It could be suggested that because their ancestors, not too long beforehand, their ancestors were involved with the Jewish people, with the Jewish people, with Yosef, and they were discriminated against by the Egyptians. So when the Jews left Egypt, perhaps they identified to some degree with the Jews. And we could suggest that the Hyksos had some sympathy for the Jewish people. And perhaps a number of them went through conversion. Who converted them? Could say there were Jews in Egypt that could have converted them. And it could be suggested, I don't want to give a whole share on it, but according to some Shitos, even without a Bezdin, before Matan Torah, there might have been able to be a form of conversion. So, and also the question is asked about how Avraham was able to marry Keturah, because the Avos, the patriarchs, fulfilled the whole Torah. And the halacha is that for 3 generations, you're not allowed to marry a mistress. And Keturah was Hagar, and Hagar was the daughter of Paro. And perhaps, I don't know, the Hyksos were not original Egyptians. They were considered invaders of Egypt, and that's why they were expelled later on. Perhaps we could answer that Hagar, the Paro at the time of Avram, perhaps, was also from this group that were not original Egyptians. Now, on the other hand, you take a look at Basia, Bas Paro. Clearly, the Paro at the time of the Exodus was not somebody who had sympathy for the Jews. It's not likely that he was from the Hyksos, and according to almost all historians, he was from a later group. And nevertheless, we see that his daughter, Basia, according to our sages, she not only saved Moshe, she not only had sympathy for Jewish children, but she went through conversion. That's why she went down to the Yor. She went down to the Nile River to wash herself, which our sages say were a form of conversion. As a matter of fact, the Brisker Rav uses this as a raya, uses this as a proof that there was Kedushas Yisrael, there was sanctity of the Jewish people, some degree of sanctity of the Jewish people even before the giving of the Torah. Because if there wasn't an idea of sanctity of the Jewish people before the giving of the Torah, how could Basia go through a process of gerus, a process of conversion? And the Brisker Rav says something that I I have some trouble with. The Brisker Rav says, how do we see from the Chumash that says Vayered Lirchotz Bayor, she went down to wash herself in the Yor? How do we see, as Chazal say, Megigule Aviha? She went to wash herself down from the idolatry of her father, and that was a form of conversion. But how do we see from the pasuk? And the Brisker Rav says that because we see from her that she had the traits of the Jewish people, Rachmanim, mercy, the traits of the Jewish people, Rachmanim, Baishanim, Gomle Chasadim. And the Torah emphasizes her Rachmanos, her Gemilas Chesed. I don't see so much the idea of Baishan here, but the Midos, the traits of the Jewish people. And the Brisker Rav seems to assume, I'm not sure why, that the Torah only associates these traits with the Jewish people. So he says that shows that she underwent conversion. I would say that the reason we can deduce that she went through Geirus, because at the end of Parshas Lech Lecha, the Torah tells us that Avraham Avinu went through Bris Milah, and that, to a large degree, represents the Geirus, the completion of the Jewishness of Avraham Avinu. And immediately after that, the Torah says, Vayera Elav Hashem, and then the whole episode of the three Malachim who are dressed like people traveling through the desert, and Avram runs and does chesed for them. He feeds them. He takes care of them. And we see there how Avram pleads on behalf of the people of Sdom. And we see there also how when they ask, where is Sarah, your wife? Sarah stayed in the tent. Baishan, modesty. In other words, we see from the Torah that the act of conversion is identified with certain character traits. When the Torah talks about conversion, and afterwards the Torah tries to tie the two together. And it could be on that basis our sages felt that the fact that the Torah talks about her going down to the Yor to wash herself, and immediately afterwards tells us about the chesed that she did. In other words, she had the traits that were necessary to undergo conversion. I was once told, I didn't see it inside, that the Chazon Ish writes in one of his letters, I think it's a very simple thing, but today, simple things, you also have to quote somebody, that when you inquire someone who wants to go through conversion, whether he'll observe the mitzvahs of the Torah, you have to make a determination. You also have to make a determination about his character traits. In other words, it's a prerequisite for the Bezdin to do Geirus, to make sure the person has the character traits that are associated with the character that a Jew should have. So, And then it's more than just that. The daughter of Paro, she opens the basket and she sees Moshe Rabbeinu as an infant there. And what does she say? Miyaldei ha'ivrim. It's obviously a Jewish child. I have to save him. Even though I'm the daughter of Paro. And I'm going against this decree. You saw a certain identification with the Jewish people. And when that comes together with the idea of her washing herself, of going down to the Nile, to the river, and the Medrash says that she, on one hand, she sent her maidservants to take the basket, and the other hand, she got involved personally. And then you see, she gives it over to Yocheved. She gives Moshe over to Yocheved to nurse him. So she's, in a sense, offering him the opportunity to remain loyal to his religion. The one that she wants to identify as her son. That could only be understood from the perspective that she herself began to see herself as a Jew. So that's why Chazal, perhaps we could suggest that that's the reason why Chazal assumed that she underwent Gerus at that time. And so we see that there were even Egyptian women that, and it's not likely that Basha was from the Hyksos. There were Egyptian women that identified with the Jewish tradition. And the question arises, where did this come from? Now it's possible, and I don't know that this is the fact, because Avram was in Egypt for a short while. But the Rambam mentions that wherever Avram went, he gave speeches, he had an impact on people. It's possible. And certainly this was strengthened with when Yosef came down to Egypt, that there was an impact on groups of people. My uncle mentions, how is it that Rivka, Rachel, and Leah grew up to be the Emos, the matriarchs of Klal Yisrael? They were brought up in the house of Psuel, the house of Lavan. So he says there was Dvorah, the Menekes, the one who took care of them. And she undoubtedly was part of the groups as Hanefesh Asherosu B'charan, that Avram, wherever he went, had groups of people that followed him. They didn't necessarily become Jewish, but at that time, there was a certain identification with Avram. Perhaps in Egypt, he wasn't there. He was there only a very short time. Paro gets rid of him very quickly after the whole episode with Sarah. But who knows? Maybe he set the foundation for certain groups, pockets of Egyptians. And perhaps, and they had an influence on Basha. And perhaps they had an influence on the midwives, according to the Medrash, that they were Egyptians. So it's possible, And just as Dvorah had an influence on Rivka and Rachel and Leah. And that would be indicative. So if Maaseh b'machshava tchila, and it shows also the lasting impact that Avram Avinu had wherever he went. Now, when we take a look, now, however, there is a strange thing. The question is, we say, Vayas lahem batim. It seems, since it was batim, houses, for the midwives were women, it would have probably been better to say Vayas lahen batim. So the question is, why does the pasuk say Vayas lahem batim? And I think we take a look at the beginning of Shemos, and Rashi already is troubled by the question. It's repeating what it says in Vayigash. In Shemos, Ve'el Shemos b'nei Yisrael, boy Mitzrayma, Eish Yaakov, Ishu Beisabo, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, the Yehuda. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came down to Egypt together with Yaakov. Each person came down with his family. Reuven, Shimon, Levi. And a similar psukim are in Vayigash. It says, Ve'el Shemos b'nei Yisrael haboy Mitzrayma, Yaakov v'banav, B'chor Yaakov. These are the names of the sons of Israel that came to Egypt. Yaakov and his sons. And the first son was Reuven, and lists all of Reuven's sons, and then the second son is Shimon, and it lists all the sons of Shimon. So why repeat? Why repeat it here? So Rashi cites the Medrash that they're like stars, that God calls them by the names when they come in, when they come out. That also has to be understood. I think part of the idea is that stars gives light. From a distance, stars give light. In darkness, not only that, we know today, stars that are no longer there, the light that came from them reach us later. We think those stars are still there. And we could suggest that the Shvatim are like stars in the sense of their impact on future generations when they're no longer there. But I want to suggest a different approach. Now, when you take a look, let's say at the Meraglim, the episode of Meraglim is mentioned in Parshas Shalach, and the episode of Meraglim is mentioned in Parshas Dvarim. And Chazal already asked the question. In Parshas Shalach, the Torah tells us that like it was a command from God. God commands, send spies to spy out the land. And in Chumash Dvarim, in Parshas Dvarim, the Torah tells us, Moshe says, you, the Jewish people, approached me and suggested we send out. Batita Beina Hadover, and I thought it was a good idea. And then God gives, so it seems to be a contradiction. In Shalach, it seems that God commands. And here it seems that Jewish people suggested, Moshe thought it was a good idea. So the Medrash says that the Jewish people came to Moshe and suggested it. Moshe thought it was a good idea, and he raised the question with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Shlach L'cha, if you want, send them. Shlach L'cha, if you want, send it. He leaves it up to Moshe. But one reading the simple psukim and shalach don't get that impression. The impression is it's a command of God. Why didn't the Torah tell it to us that way? Okay, there's a hint to it. But the answer is the Torah wants to take us through that situation to sense the attitude of the Jewish people at that time. And from the perspective of that time, once they got permission, they thought it was a command because they wanted to believe that it was a command. They wanted to believe that it was a mitzvah. Very often we get a heter for something. And for whatever reason, it's not enough in our minds that we got a heter for it. We want to turn it into a mitzvah. So the heter becomes, that was the attitude of the Jewish people at that time. Torah wants us to understand what was the attitude of the Jewish people. But then Chumash Dvarim, we're looking back. When we're looking back, we realize it was our fault. It was the Jewish people's fault. So sometimes the Parsha, and we have other cases, the two Parshas, the beginning of Parshas, I don't want to go into it now, is the same way. Tells us a situation from the perception, from the point that the situation takes place. And then looking back, we see an altogether different perspective of what happened. And I think when you take a look at the differences between Shemos and Vayigash, you get that same approach. In Vayigash, in Vayigash, they come down as one family. In Shemos, Ishu Beisobo, it didn't remain one family. Each family was itself, but Eish Yaakov Ishu Beisobo. Yaakov remained part of each and every family. Even though Reuven started his own family, Shimon started his own family, Levi started his own family. But Yaakov was part and parcel of each separate family. However, in Egypt, they were all one family. Now,
in Egypt or in Canaan?
What?
In Egypt or in Canaan?
In Canaan, they were all one family. And the determination of the brothers was that the situation should continue. The brothers felt a certain insecurity. That's why they were threatened. My uncle points out, and we go, why were they threatened by Yosef's dream? They were threatened by Yosef's dream because they're in a different land. In a different land, they didn't feel so secure. They didn't feel secure economically. But even more than that, they didn't feel secure religiously. Who knows what the new environment will bring? So, the dream was, we're in an agricultural country. We're no longer shepherds. The whole situation changes. So they were insecure. So even after the whole episode of Yosef was more secure, but not completely secure either. So the idea of everything remaining the same, and it's a very interesting medrash. The medrash says that the Daskein Baal Tosfos actually brings it down in Baal Turim, that when they went down to Egypt, in Vayigash, it says, Vayisu v'nei Yisrael es Yaakov aviem ves Nisheim ves tapam al hagolos. The simple explanation is Yaakov was an old man, and the wives and children were weak, so they rode on the wagons. But the Baal Turim says, and the Daskenim Baal Tosfos, Vayisush Yaakov Avihem, they carried Yaakov on their shoulders. Vesnasheim Vestapam al Golos, their wives and their infants on the wagons. What's the idea? In the end of a baseball game, let it be a World Series game, the one who was considered the hero of the game, they carry him on the shoulders. He's the hero. In the old country, who is the person that everybody looks up to? The person everybody looks up to is the elder of the family. But when you go to a new country, who becomes almost the one giving direction? The youngest in the family, the one that has the least ties to the old country, the one who is most likely to become part of the environment of the new country without hindrance. But the Bnei Yaakov were determined that the situation will remain the same. So they carried Yaakov on their shoulders, showing, Yaakov, we're going down to Egypt. It's an altogether different country. But the situation is going to remain the same. And to a certain degree, at least for 1 or 2 generations, the situation remained the same. However, afterwards, things began to change. But initially, even initially, it was a change. Whereas before they were one family, now they became many separate families. But Yaakov remained the hero. He was part of every family. Now, and it's interesting. It's interesting that in Parshas Vayechi, I actually talked about it at our minyan. Our minyan is outside between Mincha and Ma'ariv. So it's when Yaakov brought Menashe and Ephraim for a bracha. So Yaakov said, Mi eleh, who are these people? He already asked for them. He certainly knew who they were. So the Medrash says, Yaakov felt the Ruach HaKodesh departing from him. Why? Because they were going to have descendants that would rebel against HaKodesh Baruch Hu. So he asked, Mi eleh, who are these people? She'enam ruyim lebracha, they're not deserving of a bracha. So Yosef took out his shtar ersin, his marriage contract, and his ksuva, contract. He says, Banai asher nasan li elokim bazeh, that God gave me here or with this. So question is, what's going on here? But the answer is when Yaakov realized that the future generations of Menashe and Ephraim will go astray and lead Jewish people astray, he thought maybe it was the Egyptian influence of Egypt. So now it's very interesting. What was the bracha that Yaakov gave Menashe and Ephraim? He said, they should become many, like fish in the sea, in the midst of the land. It's a bracha period of Arivia, a bracha of multiplying, of having many descendants. Now, it's very interesting. The Rambam's opinion is that one only fulfills the mitzvah of having descendants if they're born in a marriage relationship. But if someone has children outside of a marriage relationship, certainly they do not completely fulfill the mitzvah of Pirya V'Rivya. Lisa Isha, the Rambam the Kosera says, be Be'ersin uveksuva velifros lirbos mimena. So it has to be part of a marriage relationship. Now, with children brought outside a marriage relationship, that's not the full mitzvah of Pirya Verivya. Now, Yosef was scared about why did Yaakov at first want him to give the bracha, and then he hesitated. Because true, they were brought up in Egypt, but they were brought up in Yosef's house, in a house that would be able to protect them from the influence of the immoral society of Egypt. But then he saw future generations might deviate from the path. Perhaps that's the Egyptian influence. Apparently, the sons of Yosef were brought up on the street. They weren't brought up in the house. They weren't brought up as part of the relationship. So Yosef showed the marriage contract. No, Yaakov, my children were not brought up on the street. My children were protected from the influence of the street. They were part of a special relationship that I had. And what is the ksuva? The ksuva shows shalom bayis. Why did Chachamim institute the ksuva? In order that the woman shouldn't always feel that she's under the threat of being divorced. When a husband knows that there's consequences to the divorce, he'll be more careful. That's conducive to peace in the house. I mentioned the Rambam at the end of Hilchos Chanukah. He says that if you have a choice between a Chanukah candle and a candle, a Shabbos candle, the Shabbos candle comes first because the purpose of the Shabbos candle is for peace in the house, or it contributes to peace in the house. So, and then the Rambam goes into a whole speech about the importance of Shalom Bayis and the importance of peace. Why didn't he? Why the Rambam should have discussed that in Hilchos Shabbos, where the main place for discussing the laws of Shabbos candles? Why did he discuss in Hilchos Chanukah? So I suggested that the reason is because the Rambam Nigros mentions the Medrash Chanukah that with the Greeks made a gzera. One of the worst decrees is that Jews couldn't have doors on their house. Why? Because the Greeks saw they could close down the shuls, they could close down the yeshivas, they could close down the Beis HaMikdash, but Jewish tradition will continue in the house. So in order to make the Jews fearful of continuing the tradition, they made a gzera, you can't have doors on the house. So that's why in Hilchos Chanukah, but all that works if there's peace in the house. If there's no peace in the house, then the house can't be a bastion for protecting the perpetuation of the tradition. And that's what so Yosef showed a Shtar Erson, and he showed a Shtar Ksuva also. In other words, my children are deserving of the bracha Pirya. Why did Yaakov hesitation? Because Menashe and Ephraim were going to be the symbol of a bracha Pirya, of having future generations. But if they were not brought up in a house, not brought up within a family relationship, both halachically and b'metzias, and really, you could be brought up halachically in a family relationship, but you're brought up actually afterwards on the street. So he said, my children were brought up in a house, not just a house that was a halachic house, in a house that there was shalom bayis, that we were able to counteract the influence of the street. So this was even Yosef, who was able to deal more with the outside than his brothers, who was not afraid of change, who did not feel insecure. But he knew we have to counteract the outside influence, and that only could be done by the house, by the home. I want to suggest that, and that's the reason why we see that the Miyaldos, when they gave help the women have children, they did not give up the job at that point. They took care of the children in their formative life, in the very beginning of their life. They wanted to initiate a certain type of attitude. And I would like to suggest an alternative pshat to Rashi. Vayas lohem batim. God made for them homes after the Miyaldos Ha'ivrios. After the Miyaldos Ha'ivrios demonstrated demonstrated their fear of God, the Mesiras Nefesh. And they kept the Jewish children alive. So then God joined them, and God provided homes for the Jewish children. So the Jewish children, yes, there was a lot of Avodah Zarah that went on in Egypt, but the Jewish identification, and to a large degree, a large part of the Masorah, and Chazal tell us that the Jews always, even in the worst of times, identified themselves as Jews. Why? Because they weren't only born, they had homes. Vayas lahem batim. God made for them homes, made homes for the Jews, and specifically the Jewish children that the Miyaldos saved, but perhaps for all the Jewish children. And we say that b'schus nashim tzidkanios nigalu Yisrael miMitzrayim, the woman is their keres habayis. And according to some Rishonim, that's the reason they helped bring the miracle. Here we see that they helped bring the miracle also. They provided the houses that gave the Jewish people, the Jewish children, the ability. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave them the opportunity. Wasn't so easy in Egypt, the opportunity. And that's why we say, Ve'ez batenu hitzil. He saved our homes. When God in Mitzrayim, and that's why the Jewish people had to be in their houses when they celebrated Pesach, because the survival of the Jewish people was ve'ez batenu hitzil. It's through the batim that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave the Jews the opportunity to have, because they showed Mesiras Nefesh, that the Jewish people were able to survive Golus Mitzrayim, the slavery of Egypt. And that is what gives us the opportunity to survive all the Goliaths, all the exile that we faced in the future. Okay.
Thank you. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. Malchus can be Yisrael. Well,
Yeah,
it is Yehuda.
Yehuda.
It doesn't look like there's any questions.
Okay. All right. Next week, if we can make it like 15 minutes later, is that okay? I